So far in this course, we've looked at how we can contribute toward achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 by integrating education for sustainable development in ways that span traditional subject area silos and that engage a wide array of community stakeholders. We've talked about practical ways that we can advocate for enabling policy and curriculum, how we can plan ESD integrated lessons that promote learner agency, and how we can connect content to our communities. In this fifth and final module, we will talk about how we can measure this work. For many of you who came to this course out of your passion for building a more sustainable world, the Sustainable Development Goal framework that we've been grounding this discussion at VSD in may be new to you. As we covered in our introduction video, the Sustainable Development Goals are a set of goals that countries across the world have committed to achieve by 2030. And they are designed to guide action by governments, businesses, civil society, and everyday citizens to build a better world for everyone. In addition to laying out this framework for action, the SDGs also offer specific indicators that countries and stakeholders can use to measure and track our shared progress toward achieving these global goals. This module grounds some of what might be more familiar ideas about measuring student learning and progress within this larger SDG indicator framework to help us develop ideas and tools for measuring and documenting progress toward achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4.7. The essential questions we'll discuss in this module include: what are the indicators that the United Nations uses to measure SDG 4.7? And what are some of the limitations? What are some country case studies? How do you measure local or subnational impact of sustainable development progress? What does the indicator development process look like? And what education for sustainable development competencies and skill areas should be measured? Commentary from our experts will be presented alongside some practical ideas from our Center for Sustainable Development team's Director of Education, Radhika Iyengar.
Welcome to this section of measurement and metrics of Target 4.7. So in this section, let's remind ourselves on what we have actually accepted to be measured on. So as the Target 4.7 states, by 2030, ensure that all learners will be able to acquire the knowledge and the skills needed to promote sustainable development. And then it goes on that sustainable division of the sustainable development is as follows: education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender and equity, and promote culture of peace and non-violence. That's more of the global citizenship side. So who is responsible for measuring these UN indicators? For education, it's the UNESCO Institute of Statistics that is responsible to collect all these different indicators on Target 4.7.
We've been fortunate to be able to work with UNESCO, the ESD section, as well as with the UNFCCC, which is the intergovernmental body that has developed the Action for Climate Empowerment program. And they're discussing the different indicators. So there is a specific target, 13.3 in the SDGs, focuses specifically on climate change education. And there has been a distinct indicator, 13.3.1, focused on the inclusion of climate in the K-12 curricula. However, through those discussions and in the effort to do better global monitoring on this, the decision has been made to have the 13.3 indicator align with 4.7, which was already the case with the sustainable consumption indicator of 12.8.1. Education for sustainable consumption. So now all three of the specific indicators in the SDGs that link education and environmental issues will now all be using 4.7.1.
So with that, there's now one target for the SDG 4.7, 13.3, 12.8 that are now on sort of what we need to be looking for in regards to education for sustainable development. And that's like making sure that the particular content is integrated across national curriculum, teacher training, policy, and student assessment, I think are the four areas.
The global indicators that we have are, because they are global indicators, are at a very abstract level. I mean, for Target 4.7 specifically, we basically survey countries and ask them how they assess their own integration of education for sustainable development into policies, into curricula, into teacher training, into assessment mechanisms. So we depend very much on what the countries inform us on. at a relatively general level. For example, we have found in our recent data that there's a big disconnect between a strong policy commitment by countries and what is actually done in teacher training. So just to show that this kind of relatively abstract monitoring mechanism already does give us some interesting indications with regard to gaps and the work that is still needed.
To measure target 4.7, UIS has listed 5 indicators that help to track the progress of target 4.7 based on various country reportings. Some of them are more quantitative in nature and some of them are very qualitative. As you can imagine, measuring global citizenship education, peace education, promoting culture, environmental education, education for sustainable development is not an easy task. So the countries could report based on storytelling measures, based on their voluntary reviews that they send every year to track some of those measures. Some concrete, more quantifiable measures of target 4.7 are percentage of schools that provide life skills based HIV and sexuality education, and percentage of students in the final grade of lower secondary education showing proficiency in knowledge of environmental science and geosciences. They are very much quantifiable and they could be sent as indicators to UIS.
But it falls short because this is really just whether or not we're integrating specific science concepts into the curriculum, right, or into the teacher training and assessment and so on. And if we really want to truly see ESD make good on its sort of vision of not just teaching about sustainable development, but really teaching for sustainable development, then we need to see concepts beyond just the science of climate change or topics in sustainable development, but really some of those interlinking socio-ecological principles that are, that have broken down in our current sort of social structures and economic structures, but that need to really be actively promoted and restored if we really want to see sustainable development.
So we have to design a new educational modality that actually yields empowerment, agency, hope, and capacity.
We are aware of the Global Education Monitoring Report, which has many sections of reporting SDG 4.7. They work with UIS very closely to take those indicators and do an in-depth analysis based on their own academic reviews. For example, they do textbook reviews and have listed down ways of identifying themes that come up in textbooks. For example, how many times have human rights, which include social justice, human rights education, freedom, democracy, rights, have occurred in those national curriculums or textbooks, various themes of sustainable development that have come up in the national curriculums and how many times they've occurred. For example, climate change, renewable energy, waste management, economic sustainability, others. Similarly, for peace education and non-violence, global citizenship education, as well as gender equality. These are the big strands of SDG 4.7. And the Global Education Monitoring Report does a good job of identifying those themes, working with various academicians in various countries who are engaged in a much more global review of these themes emerging in national curriculums and textbooks. We need many countries to be sending in their voluntary national reviews to indicate the progress towards target 4.7.
What this kind of monitoring doesn't give us is it doesn't show us much about the richness of work that is happening on the ground and the impact that the many good practices on the ground have, and also the gaps that exist on the ground. And I think here at the moment, the best that we have is really to work with collections, repositories of good practice, maybe outside of the traditional monitoring mechanisms, work more with narrative approaches, with qualitative descriptions of what is happening. Sometimes at UNESCO, what we have tried sometimes is to have like more of a journalistic approach to it, to tell a story about an individual person in a community or about an individual school that can then inspire others. Of course, that's not the kind of measurable progress or that not measurable in the traditional sense that helps you with some kind of global monitoring, but it's certainly the kind of monitoring that provides a lot of inspiration to others.
So now going back to how our country is actually measuring target 4.7 actually varies. The indicators and the goals itself are so wide that it gives a lot of scope for the countries to adapt it to their own education systems. For example, in the US, one of the indicators listed under target 4.7 is percentage of US 8th graders attending public or private schools that emphasize world affairs to a moderate or a great extent. This, I would imagine, would capture global citizenship education. This is one of the examples that the US adapts or has adapted to ensure that they are measuring target 4.7. At the sub-national level, which is at the state or a county level, there is a big disconnect between what the actions are locally versus what is presented as an indicator format nationally. So we would assume that many of the activities that are currently going on at the district level or at the state level are not adequately represented at the national level. For example, in the US, the state of New Jersey is actually the first state which has adapted the climate change education as an integral part of the formal school curriculum. So all of New Jersey schools have to take the standards and adapt climate change education throughout, interweave it throughout the formal school curriculum. Now, this is a big accomplishment and has not been reported at the national level, or there is no space for such nuance stories to come up as a part of the reporting of SDG 4.7.
If we want to look at it from a content perspective, let's go beyond the climate science to really thinking about the social science behind climate change, the sociological, historical, geographical components that are the underlying drivers of climate change, right? So really thinking about social structures of inequality and inequity, thinking about things like gender inequality and how that structures not only the disparate experiences of the effects of climate change, but then helps to perpetuate the processes of exploitation and oppression that drives climate change. So some of the sociological elements, right? Because if we're just focusing on like whether or not we understand the biophysical components of atmosphere and greenhouse gases, like that perpetuates the conception that climate change is a technical problem and that it's not a social problem as well, like a societal problem as well, right? And a technical approach means that we'll also be perpetuating technical solutions. So we'll be really drawn towards the techno fixes, like creating innovative renewable energy or creating, things that are really easily measurable and trackable. But in terms of their leverage point is it has a smaller sort of leverage on impacting the problem. But if we get sort of to the bigger leverage points where, we're thinking about mindset change, paradigmatic change, beliefs, values, attitudes, those things that have much broader impact on our ability to make change on or affect climate change, that requires a different kind of accountability mechanism and a different kind of monitoring. So not just monitoring the easily measured cognitive and behavioral outcomes or learning outcomes, but thinking about the harder to measure socio-emotional aspects, the interpersonal aspects, and some of those 21st century skills that we're struggling to measure. We need to figure out a way to measure these things, because that is really, I think, where measurement needs to go in terms of like inclusive participation, right? So even though children wouldn't be voting, there would be other forms or other ways of measuring and tracking whether or not communities are creating spaces for youth engagement and civic participation, right? So I think there are other ways we can do it. We can sort of hold actors accountable by trying to proxy what might be some behavioral outcomes or some process outcomes that are different and that would indicate that something else has changed, right? It's an imperfect measure, but it at least allows us to begin to think about how do we incentivize the system to start changing. How many fora have been created in community decision-making processes to incorporate youth voices? Like that would be an easy measure to really think about inclusion and participation, right? And that would then spur on perhaps teachers then in the classroom talking about these kinds of things, what it means to engage in these kinds of things, what it means to formulate an opinion and to bring evidence to one's arguments.
Thinking about empowerment as what you measure. How many students and teachers are empowered in generating empowerment? Part of that is contributing by informal education, by families, by other community education initiatives. Empowerment is multiple things are generating empowerment, but I think that's kind of where we need to go, because if we're going to change everything, we've got to be empowered.
We don't have time necessarily to wait for the perfect measure. We need to understand how we can really push the system to start valuing these kinds of outcomes as equal to whether or not you know how to regurgitate a scientific concept.
The big work is to really reimagine, reframe, repurpose, redo assessment, because it's the one that just seems to constantly put people back into reverse, no matter how radical and interesting and exciting their pedagogy is, or their learning is, or their transformative thinking is. When it hits the assessment platform, it just goes right back to ground zero.
There is also a big disconnect between the state and the district level reporting of SDG 4.7. For example, in many districts in India, there are a lot of tree plantation drives that happen. Even those numbers are accumulated at the national level, but they are generally not reported as a part of educating children on environmental sustainability or education for sustainable development. Similarly, there are many initiatives of reuse, recycle, refuse at the municipality level in many townships, but again, they are not represented in the national frameworks of sustainability or national frameworks that report SDG 4.7. So we can get some glimpse of what the nations or what these countries are doing through the through the voluntary national reviews that they send. But I would assume that there is a big gap between what is treated to be sustainable education for sustainable development, SDG 4.7, since it is intersectoral, gets missed out on reporting these actions or these measures at the national level. An example of New Jersey's reporting on SDG 4.7, I would assume, and the gap between the national reporting and the county level reporting is very evident. For example, in Milburn district in Essex County, we have been doing a lot of plastic pollution control. We have been taking up many environmental actions, challenges that common citizens are taking. But those have really not been reported as SDG 4.7. They may be reported through other mediums, but they are not reported as SDG 4.7. So in that case, maybe some actions could be to have a digital map of these actions or best practices that could be developed at a local level, which could inform the national strategies, could inform best practices, which could also be a great example of visually depicting all these wonderful best practices that are all aligned to education for sustainable development. Some of these disconnect that we saw between the counties as well as the districts as well as the state level indicators on SDG 4.7 could be very simple indicators. For example, outlining the neighborhoods that have a lot of climate change related issues and seeing what are the students in those places doing to make others aware of these climate challenges, as well as taking up some environmental action, maybe writing to their own Washington DC representatives. So I think there are many actions like that that could attribute towards education for sustainable development, climate change education. For example, the school boards being involved in various different green challenges, the school's green teams being involved, the parent-teacher associations being involved, small businesses that are there in the communities that are green and sustainable businesses, local NGOs, citizen-led groups that are very active. Number of those or percentages of those could be listed. Some key practices that schools are adopting to stop maybe plastic pollution and other cases could be there. So I believe there are a lot of these activities going on in various counties in the US, including examples that I mentioned elsewhere also. They are currently not being listed as indicators that could be helpful to track the progress or progression of cities and towns towards meeting the goals of Target 4.7.
More and more communities are now tracking their sustainable community indicators, and kids, that's a great way for them to track their trust fund, and they can help develop the indicator sets and they can help monitor them over time.
Another interesting way of reporting on SDG 4.7 could be done locally by any stakeholders, whether it be green team members, whether it be parent teacher associations or the town's board of education members, to see how well education for climate change or environmental education or education for sustainable development is infused in various different curriculum or textbooks. We don't have to wait for national reviews to happen or for UNESCO to come up with a multi-case study. We can take this idea of an equity audit and develop an equity audit on textbooks and on curriculums, but just by identifying simple questions and indicators that we could track through these equity audits. Maybe make a checklist of some sorts, maybe have 10 items that list down based on your priorities or any stakeholder that's interested in understanding how SDG 4.7 could be integrated into the curriculum. So some examples are, does climate change education curriculum span across all subjects, or is it treated as a separate subject? Does the climate change education curriculum include local environmental challenges, or is it only exclusively based on global issues? Is there flexibility in the design of the curriculum for the teachers to improvise? Were the schools and teachers and educators consulted to co-create the curriculum? Those are some examples of this kind of equity audit that could be conducted by any stakeholders. The main idea of the equity audit is to empower local citizens whose kids are going to schools so that they can be reporting based on concrete measures. They can be reporting based on what their equity audit is saying. The best possible way of doing an equity audit will be to sit with local stakeholders, as many as possible, in your own townships, to create a concrete list of climate change education or education for sustainable development checklist, and seeing whether those indicators that are prioritized by local stakeholders, are they being incorporated in the schools or not. And through this course, we will give you a list that you could start with. It is by no means an exhaustive list, but it just gives you a flavor of the possibilities or the type of questions that you can include.
We've reached the end of Module 5. Let's take a moment to review the action framework. In Module 1, we discussed some action steps that stakeholders can take to advocate for enabling policy. In Module 2, we discussed how you can plan lessons and pedagogical approaches that integrate education for sustainable development, and we built on this conversation in Module 3 with concrete examples that build learner agency. In Module 4, we offered steps you can take to identify opportunities for school-community connection, and as we just discussed, this Module 5 offers a sample Education for Sustainable Development equity audit tool for conducting an initial audit of your education space to identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges for further integrating education for sustainable development, as well as ideas for monitoring and documenting the kinds of ESD actions you and your learners are taking. Be sure to check out our resources section for sample tools and guides you can use to take the actions we discussed throughout this course. We hope these resources are helpful to you in continuing your journey toward achieving SDG 4.7 in your education space and contributing to a greener, healthier world for all of us. Thank you for being part of this course. Please reach out to us with any questions or ideas. We look forward to hearing and learning from your stories.